Hello, and welcome to another segment of the Coatesville Area Public Library's Oral History Project. I'm Kirk Witmer, and with me today is a native Coatesvillian of 66 years. I have with me Mr. Eugene Diorio, who is president of the Greystone Society, president and director since its inception in 1984. Good morning, Gene. It's nice to have you with us.
My pleasure to be here.
Gene, as we were preparing for our interview today, we were noticing some of the students that are here in the building, and you commented on styles of dress and how they've changed. And I know that you were born in the early 30s.
Correct.
Right smack in the middle of the Depression era. But yet styles, well, you tell us about styles of clothing for students in those days.
Well, I think, Kurt, that styles aren't always a question of economics. It's a question of what is fashionable at the time. Also, when you're dealing with high school, college age, you're dealing with peer pressure. I mean, if it were fashionable to wear overcoats in July and bathing suits in January, they would do it because of peer pressure. But yes, I grew up in a more formal age. Shirts and ties were required all the way through grade school and Catholic school, and ditto in high school. And usually jackets, and certainly in college it was jacket and tie. And today when I see the kids looking like the latest Abercrombie and Fitch leisure catalog, I realize how old I am, and yes, things have changed.
You also mentioned to me that discipline back then was quite a bit different than it is now.
Yes, I suppose so. Back in the dark ages, you were expected to pay attention and sit up straight and posture and everything else. And I must say the nuns in Catholic school were pretty serious about that. And if you've ever been rapped over the knuckles, which was not uncommon in those days, you get the message. I don't think it hurt any of us, though.
No, I'm sure it didn't.
I would make that point that I don't think discipline hurt any of us.
Gene, in your work as president and director of the Greystone Society, I'm sure you've uncovered a lot of details in the history of our city. Has there been anything in particular that you have found especially amazing? Because I know I'm getting quite an education as I do these interviews for this project.
That's a good question. Of course, being interested in history all my life, and certainly got interested in local history, particularly during my years at Lucan's, when I got interested in the history of the Lucan's Company. I haven't found things too amazing. I think perhaps the most amazing thing we've had to deal with is the idea that Coatesville is not historic. We've had eyes rolled and eyebrows raised by people who are amazed that we have an organization in Coatesville that's actually working to preserve historic houses and hoping to develop tourism based on historic preservation. There is this attitude, even among a great many people who live in this city, that Coatesville is not historic. And this seems to be fairly widespread unless you look into it. Just recently I attended a township meeting in another township that happens to have a property that I'm involved with, and I was asked by the township supervisors, did I think it was worthwhile for them to consider a historic preservation ordinance or to get into survey. And I said yes. And they said, well, we're really not a historic area. I said, well, I don't think you could scratch any township in all the 67 municipalities of Chester County, for that matter, the whole southeastern Pennsylvania region, without finding historical things. So, of course, I do firmly believe that you should do a survey. Coatesville did a survey of its properties over 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. Although the city has not been a forerunner in historic preservation until recently, the city actually was the first in Chester County to create any sort of historic preservation ordinance. When the city created the Coatesville Historic Commission in 1964, I believe it was, and gave the commission the duty, the responsibility to survey the city and come up with a listing of buildings or properties that would be considered historic landmarks for architectural reasons, historic reasons, community reasons, or whatever. And people were surprised with the number of buildings that we designated. we were sort of pioneers, and I guess that was one reason why we had such a hard time getting support. Now, of course, Coatesville recognizes that historic preservation can be a tool, as it has been in many communities, for urban renewal. But I would say the most difficult and most interesting thing has been this sort of mental block, this attitude that Coatesville's not historic, and that, of course, is nonsense. People have this block.
I have to ask you, Gene, do you get a sense of resistance from the community in terms
Sometimes,
of,
yes.
But is it really that, or is it more a case of just lack of understanding?
Sometimes it's a lack of understanding, very definitely. For example, at this township meeting, someone brought up the question, well, we don't want a historical commission that's going to tell us what color to paint our front porch. Well, I have to agree, sometimes commissions have got overwrought, but there's a lot more important than paint colors. Preservation of the building itself. But there is a resistance. I think with all historic preservation ordinances, you're probably running into one of the basic conflicts of democracy. On one side, the concept of freedom, I can do what I want, and don't you tell me what color I can paint my house,
my property, yeah.
or how to handle, yes, the sacred right of private property. On the other hand, you're dealing with the basic tenet, the basic floor plan of democracy, that what is done is for the common good. The thought that a city does have the right to regulate itself to a degree to protect the whole city. Now, we're standing here filming this with New York City in the background, the wealthiest, largest, richest city in America. A city which until the mid-60s had nothing in the way of historic preservation ordinances. And one after another, some very great buildings in New York were demolished. Then, in the mid-60s, came the demolition of Pennsylvania Station, the magnificent railroad station built in the early 1900s, one of the greatest buildings ever built in America, a monument, and also a building of superb practicality in terms of functional railroad station. Well, it was demolished. The public outcry was so great that New York City Council got the message, did a total turnaround, passed legislation created the New York Landmarks Commission. New York now has one of the toughest landmark commissions in America. Well, a few years later, the Penn Central Corporation, having gotten away with demolishing Penn Station, decided to wipe out Grand Central, which is a couple blocks to the east on 42nd Street. And by this time, the Historic Landmark Commissions, New York said, no, you can't do it. So they took him to court, sued. And again, this is private property. This belongs to the stockholders of the Penn Central, not to the city of New York. How dare you tell us what to do? Well, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, oh, yes, the city does have the right for the common good of the city to protect and to regulate. Mm-hmm. It's still a railroad station. You can't claim that we are taking your property. So now New York is glorying in the preservation of landmarks. Grand Central has just gone through a major restoration. In fact, I'm looking forward to taking a look at it in a few days. And everybody is thrilled that this great landmark, such a symbol of the city, has survived. And I'm sure you've been following the restoration of the public library on Fifth Avenue, which is one of the greatest buildings in the city, too, which is now being restored to its Beaux-Arts magnificence. The reading room just opened a few weeks ago, a lot of publicity about it. And people are celebrating this architecture, which 20 years ago they were happily consigning to the rubbish heap over there in Jersey. So yes, it's the private property arguments, but slowly I think, and I think another reason is that the post-war period, the 50s to 60s, was probably one of the dimmest periods in the architectural history of the world, and people are so bored with these boxes that now even the modern architects are trying to design traditional Art Deco or whatever buildings. So it's come a circle.
Mm-hmm. Gene, I'd like to ask you about city government. We've had a variety of styles over the life of our community here. So if you would, could you take us back and give us the litany of the changes from the time that we were once Coatesville?
Okay.
All right.
Well, of course, the area was inhabited before it was organized as any sort of municipality. The name Coatesville comes from the early 19th century, when Moses Coates' son-in-law, whose name was Jesse Kersey, conceived the idea of developing building lots along what is now Main Street And of course, in the 1790s, the Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike was put through. The first toll road and a major reason for economic development. Here's this great highway here. So Mr. Kersey, who was a Quaker missionary but also had a mind for development, decided to take part of his father-in-law's land and make it into building lots, and he called it Coates Villa. Nothing has changed. Today, realtors chop up the countryside and call it Steeplechase Hollow or something like this, or green fields, and so he called it Coates Villa in honor of his father-in-law, Moses Coates. And Kersey and his partner, Isaac Pennock, had purchased this property from Moses Coates in 1810. The name was later made into one word, Coatesville, but we were a part of Valley Township. We were a village as the village grew. We were a village in Valley Township. Another village grew in the West End. It was known as Midway. And there's a bit of history involved there because in the 1830s, the state of Pennsylvania created a great public works act called the Main Line of Public Works. And the objective was to connect Philadelphia with Pittsburgh with a then state-of-the-art transportation system, which involved building a railroad from Philadelphia to the Columbia, and then use of canals from the Columbia up the Susquehanna to the Juniata into the mountains, and then crossing the mountains with a series of portage railways until you got to the Allegheny, and then you came down the Allegheny in canal boats again. If you were lucky, you could make it in about 3 days. The only successful part of it was the railroad, which was put through from Philadelphia to Columbia. And the west end of what is now Coatesville was exactly the halfway point. So they established a station. Midway. So hence the name Midway. And some older residents of Coatesville still refer to the west end as Midway. The station was somewhere where that coal yard was on Main Street, about a block and a half down from the bridge over the tracks. Well, in 1867, the two villages, the village of Coatesville and the village of Midway, merged and formed the borough of Coatesville. That was the incorporation as a municipality, and it was taken out of Valley Township, and we became the borough of Coatesville as a separate municipality. The borough system, you had a burgess with a board of borough, they didn't call them councilmen, borough members, I've forgotten the exact word. That lasted from 1867 until 1915, when the city incorporated as a city under the state municipal codes. And at that point, you do have a mayor and council. We had, as I recall, 4 council people plus the mayor. And that system was considered the best and was wonderful that Coatesville was the only state-of-the-art, the only city government in Chester County, the only city in Chester County that really was legally designated as a city. Westchester, Phoenixville were still boroughs. Well, the failing in that was that as cities grew, you do have professional departments. You have an accounting, finance department. You have the city streets and sewers. You have the police, and you have parks and recreation, and all the various city functions. And usually, what happened was that after an election, council people were then given specific responsibilities. Now, you may have just won election, and now suddenly the mayor said, well, now you're going to look after the city streets and the sewers, and you say, well, I'm a librarian, I don't know anything about it. Well, too bad, you know. The fallacy of that form of government was that it wasn't really professional. Now, sometimes you had very dedicated people who put in a lot of time in their jobs as councilmen, but they weren't always schooled in those things. And of course, it was part-time. I mean, there was no full salary. You got a stipend for coming to council meetings. So the feeling was that we should go to a city management form of government, whereby you still have a governing body. You no longer have a mayor, but you have council people who are elected. But then you have a professional manager who is going to take care of the administration of sewers and streets, leaves, and recreation and parks and police and the rest of it. So I guess it's a good 20 years or so now since Coatesville went to the city management form of government. Seems to be working, although we've had a sort of parade of managers, but we're hoping it's stabilized.
Gene, I have to ask you about Greystone Mansion itself. That's a building that has had quite a history.
Yes.
Its current purpose is quite different than its original. Tell us a little bit about the mansion itself.
Well, as with a lot of properties, it's gone through cycles. It was built as a private home. It was built in 1889 by Abram Francis Houston. A.F. Houston was the oldest son of Dr. Charles Houston, who lived in the other house that we own, Terracina, across the street. Dr. Houston had several children, several daughters, but two sons, A.F. and his younger brother, Charles Lucas Houston. The two boys both went to Haverford College. Both came into the business, which was then a partnership. And A.F., as the oldest son, eventually succeeded his father as the president of the Lucas Iron and Steel Company after they had incorporated. He was married in 1889, and he built that house the year he was married. And it was built to be a private residence, and it continued as a private residence. Mr. Houston lived there the rest of his life. In fact, I understand he died there. He had a heart attack one morning and passed away in that house in 1930. So from the time of its construction in 1889 until his death in 1930, it was Mr. Houston's home. He had three children, three daughters, all of whom married and moved away. And a few years after his death, his widow decided to sell the property, which she did, to the city of Coatesville. The city purchased it in 1938, and in 1939, after a bit of remodeling, opened the house as Coatesville City Hall. Now, the city at that time was housed in a small three-story brick house up on Chestnut Street next to the pawn shop. And this was like moving from a east side tenement into Versailles when they got the property. So the city was there for 53 years, from 1939 until the fall of 1992 when they moved into the present municipal building. So it served its second life as an office building. Then, subsequent to that, the city really had no plans for what to do with it. The building was becoming grossly inadequate. The fact that Coatesville hasn't grown, I think, was a major reason why the city could stay there. But it never was a terribly good office building. Beautiful house, but not a terribly good practical functional layout. The old Worth Mansion that is long gone, that was at the corner of 3rd and Main, would have made a much better office building. It'd have a central hall and staircase to the back, and rooms on either side. It would have been more functional. But people loved Greystone, and Greystone has, I think there was wide respect for it. While the city didn't do much with it in terms of maintenance, as we've learned, at least they didn't make any major changes. A few major changes, but nothing too drastic that couldn't be reversed with enough money. We've always been grateful that they didn't paint up all the woodwork. So basically the house is intact, although it needs total replacement of mechanical systems. Well, the city had an architectural study done as to the advantages of building a whole new structure vis-a-vis remodeling that one. And to nobody's surprise, it made a lot of sense to build a whole new building. Trying to remodel City Hall would have destroyed it. Bring it up to codes for an office building would have destroyed much of the architectural importance. Plus, they would have still had a hodgepodge, even if they added on to it as was being considered. So the city decided to go ahead, build a new office building, which they did, and move out, and there was talk of selling it. Serious talk of selling it. I think some of the city fathers thought they could balance the city budget with the proceeds of Greystone. Well, that was a cold water bath, too, because the building needs a huge amount of money, no matter what purpose it's put to. And certainly if someone was going to make it into an office building, you still have to do the basics, plumbing, heating, wiring, and so forth, which it needs. The Greystone Society, of course, had gotten started with the idea of helping the city with the building. And that's another story, but in the meantime, we got involved with Terracina, so Greystone sort of sat. But now all of a sudden, well, what's the Greystone Society going to do about Greystone, which is where we took our society's name. And we indicated to the city we were willing to help, but that we certainly could not buy it and then try to raise money to keep it going and eventually restore it. It was impossible. So the building sat for a while, and the person who I really have to give credit to, who was most helpful, was Mr. Van Sant, who was at the time chairman of Lukens. And Bill and I talked about it a good bit, and he was very interested. His wife came on our Greystone Society board, and Bill went to council meetings with me and sat down with council and indicated that Lukens was willing to help with the restoration. They weren't going to do it all, but Lukens felt that they should take a leadership position. And what happened was that through Mr. Van Sant, the Lukens Foundation gave us a grant to do an architectural and engineering study of the building while the city still owned it, to see what we were really getting into. So we finally hired an architectural firm in Philadelphia, Daggett and Saylor, to do a study. And then subsequently, after that was done, we talked to council some more, and Mr. Van Sant again went to council with me and indicated that Lukens was willing to help. We felt the city had to do their part, forget about selling it, and turn it over to us. So finally, in the summer of 1994, the city council voted to turn Greystone Mansion over to the Greystone Society, with all the problems that went with it. The city was really getting out from burden. I mean, we have had to pick up the heating and grounds and the whole bit, and there was a huge amount of just cleanup work to do there. But they transferred it to the city, from the city to the Greystone Society, with the understanding that we would work for its preservation, that we can't sell it. If we would fail, the city possibly could take it back. But in taking it over, we put all sorts of protective covenants on the facade and on the major rooms, so that if some future entity did own it in the future, they would have to maintain the building. So that's basically it. It's gone from being a private residence to a municipal office building to now our aim is to restore it as a historic house museum, as a tourist attraction. And of course, all historic buildings, I always say, their essence is educational. People can come and see an architectural style, a decorative style, and a way of life.
Yes.
And the architects have told us that we're very fortunate that the city didn't rip out all the service areas, because too many historic houses, you see the elegant dining room, and living rooms, and libraries, but you don't know how the houses worked. But in this case, if we ever restore completely those back rooms, you can see the kitchens, the scullery, the butler's pantry, and all that. Again, the idea, that period, how did these houses work?
Yes.
There's a growing interest in the workers, not just the lords of the manor. I'm trying desperately to save a tenant house behind Terracina, which is a humble little house, but which I feel fits very strongly into the total educational scheme of things as to how other people live, not just the folks that own the mill. So that's roughly Greystones.
You've mentioned Terracina a couple of times here. The history of the two buildings is probably very closely intertwined.
Oh, absolutely.
Terracina has had what sort of a background to it?
Well, the whole street is intertwined. And a major reason why the National Park Service designated that as a National Historic Landmark in 1994 was because in one block we have all these buildings which represent the Lukens Houston family's homes. The family believed in living in the middle of town, close to the works and community with the community, not moving out to a suburb somewhere. And starting with a little house that belonged to Moses Coates, which later belonged to Isaac Pennick when they bought the property from Coates, and later was the home of Isaac Pennick's daughter, Rebecca, and her husband, Dr. Lukens. That's the starting point. Then Rebecca Lukens and Dr. Lukens had 6 children, most of whom died at early ages. But her 2 daughters who did survive married, and both of her sons-in-law came into the Lukens mill business. And both of them lived in that block. The oldest daughter married a gentleman named Abram Gibbons. The house directly across the street from Terracina, which is the VFW, was the Gibbons homestead. Then the younger daughter married Dr. Charles Houston. And Terracina was built in 1850, 1851 for them. Rebecca Lukens built the house, not for herself. She never gave up living in the humble little Brandywine mansion, despite the fact that she became the wealthiest woman in the area. That was home, and that's where all her memories was. Her husband died there, and she lived there until she died there. But Terracina was built for Dr. Charles Huston and his wife, who was Isabella Pennock Lukens Huston. Then their children, they had several children. Their children, the two sons, as they eventually grew, got out of college, came into the business and married, built their homes in the block. And Greystone was built, as I indicated, by A.F. Huston. The younger son, Charles Lukens Huston, built the house that is unfortunately gone, that was just next door to Terracina. That one was built in 1895, 1896. And then, of course, completing the collection of landmarks, when Lukens built a new office building, they built the main office, which was right across from AF's and right up the street from CL's, so it was all very close, and they lived there. Terracina remained in the Huston family ownership until the mid-1980s. Dr. Huston and his wife lived there the rest of their lives. He died in 1897. She died in 1889. One of the daughters who didn't marry used the house for a while. Then they leased it out to some Pennock cousins, Charles E. Pennock, who had owned an ironworks up the Brandywine further called Valley Ironworks. After he retired and sold his business, he moved back into Coatesville. And he leased the house. And then his two daughters, two of his children, lived there until the early 1940s. And then Stewart Huston, who was a son of Charles Lukens Huston Sr., took over the house in the early 1940s. Stewart Huston was Senior Vice President of Lukens, secretary, member of the board, intensely interested in family history, furniture, antiques, genealogy, and he absolutely adored living in that house. At a time when people were moving out of Coatesville and moving to the suburbs, Stewart continued to live there with the mill in the backyard and absolutely loved it. He died in 1971. His widow continued to use the house until the mid-1980s. And his widow was from Savannah, Georgia, and had a home of her own where she spent the winter in Savannah. Her health declined to the point where she really couldn't run back and forth, so she stayed permanently in Savannah. And Mr. Huston had willed that house to eventually go to the city of Coatesville when both he and his wife had passed on. Well, it was a beautiful gesture, but unfortunately the city of Coatesville had no money. When it was first presented the idea to them, oh yes, we'll take it. But years later, when Mrs. Huston gave up the house and subsequently passed away, and they were faced with the reality of taking it on, by that time the city's finances had declined precipitously, and the city had no money or staff. So here was the Greystone Society, which had been organized for historic preservation. Why don't you people take this on? Talk about straight climb. But there was no alternative, because we were concerned that if we didn't do it, if we didn't try to work something out, the building could be lost. And in 1982, Lukens management at the time demolished the other Huston house, and there was great fear that Terracina might go the same way. So we worked with the city and started to do some things. The Huston Foundation came to our aid early on, gave us some money to heat the place, do a few studies, and begin some restoration work. Stewart Huston had a world of interest, but maintenance wasn't one of them, and Terracina needed everything. So we took it over, and the city was very satisfied, to the point where they were glad to relieve themselves of the whole responsibility and turn it over to the Greystone Society. So we have acquired that property. Both properties, Greystone and Terracina, belong to the Greystone Society. Subsequent to Mrs. Stewart Huston's death, her husband had created a trust fund in his will. And she was a beneficiary of that during her lifetime, but after her death, it became a charitable trust, and now is operating as the Stewart Huston Charitable Trust. And as you know, they have their offices in Terracina. Well, the trustees were very anxious to bring Terracina back, and they have been the chief source of funding. We have had very large grants from them, which over the years have enabled us to bring Terracina to its present good appearances. Not just good appearances, but things like new roof, redo the chimneys, new plumbing, new wiring, new heating, air conditioning, renew the rotten woodwork, and so forth, all of which had to be done. There's so much more to historic preservation than Victorian wallpaper and a set of velvet drapes, believe me.
And the right color paint.
Yeah, right. But that's it. One final comment. Everyone wants to know, what is the origin of the word terracina? We do not know when the family first started calling that. I have found no indications that Dr. Huston, who of course was the original owner, called it that at all. It sounds very Italian. It sounds as if it means a small terrace, and of course the house is on a terrace, although I'm told that in strict pure Italian it means China land, which doesn't quite,
No,
we
it
don't
doesn't fit
know.
at all.
We really don't know. In fact, I'm inclined to think that it was Stewart Huston and his wife who may have given it the name, but I don't have any real documentation. But it's a pretty name, and the family called it that, and we've stayed with it.
So why not use it?
Yeah. Now, Greystone, we know because I found some of A.F. Huston's household personal stationery, and very clearly he called it Greystone. We always thought it was E-Y, but he spelled it A-Y, so we went to A-Y. And in fact, we've used as our logo what was his printing on his stationery.
Gene, there's another building right there in the neighborhood, and I'm talking about the opposite corner of the intersection there of First and Harmony, what is now the Devitt's, or was the Devitt's hardware
Oh,
store.
yes.
I'm sure it hasn't escaped your gaze. Do you have any
See it every
background
day.
on that building?
I don't know when it was built. An interesting point is that I will tell you first off was that it was the site of Coatesville's first public library.
Now, that I didn't know.
Yes. Mrs. Charles Huston, Dr. Huston's wife, who was Isabella Lukens, was very interested in books. And while she was, unlike her mother, not involved in the management of the ironworks, she did a lot of community work, and she felt the city needed a library. She also wrote a couple of books herself. She did a book of poetry called Autumn Leaves, and she also did a memoir of European travel, which are very much Chester County collectibles today. They were all privately printed, primarily for family and friends in small editions. She is credited with having started the first library, and it was on that spot. And the first librarian was a man named Ewart, who was some cousin of William Ewart Gladstone, the Prime Minister in Victorian England. Just how he found his way to Coatesville, I had never been able to find out. But I have a picture of him somewhere that a later Houston family member gave me. Of course, the library was long gone. I don't know when the building was built. I think it was there in the late 19th century. It was a hardware store, and of course, I remember it very well as an old-timer in Coatesville because at Christmas, they had, second floor was Toyland. And they had all kinds of electric trains, and as a small boy, I mean, you went to Devitt several times.
I remember that myself. It was a Saturday morning excursion for my father and I every year.
You had to see the Toyland, and of course, Main Street was very busy and bustling in those days, and stores were open till 9 o'clock at night during the Christmas holidays. But it was always there, but of course, in recent years, as you know, the business declined as all Main Street has gone down with the development of malls and so forth, and the store was finally closed, and in his last days at Lukens, Mr. Van Zandt, in his last couple of years, was very interested in improving that corner. The store was not a work of art. I might be chairman of the city's Harbs Board, and I can tell you that landmark designation I'd have a hard time giving to that one. But with the demolition of the buildings on the other side of the firehouse many years ago when the city wanted to widen the street there, I mean, it's not an attractive corner, and yet it's right in the middle of town. So the hope was, the thought was, the dream was to clear the whole corner and eventually make a grand park or plaza there, which would be a beautiful entrance into the Lukens Historic District. Lukens negotiated for quite some time, was never able to reach an agreement with the firehouse, which is still owned by the surviving fire corporation there, but did acquire the Devitt's property, which was the store and the land on either side of the firehouse, and demolished it. Of course, in the meantime, the company was sold, and it's sort of in limbo right now. So we're all waiting. We're a little tired of looking at that hole in the ground. They ran into a snag. There was a fuel tank, which apparently everybody forgot about, and the people demolishing hit it, and there was apparently a runoff cleanup, and I think that's what's delaying it, and of course adding enormously to the cost of clearing it. So we're just waiting to see. As you probably know, the main office is now vacant. Bethlehem is not using it. That magnificent landmark building, which has been the company's headquarters since 1903, 1904, is now empty, and we're very anxiously awaiting the future of that.
Yes. So there have been definitely a lot of changes to bring us up to 1998
Oh, yes.
as we know it today.
Yes, yes.
Gene, I can't thank you enough for being a participant here in our project. You've brought to light some things that no one else could have for us, and we're very grateful.
My years are showing, huh?
No, your research is showing,
Oh.
and we appreciate that very much.
My pleasure to be here.